Open source is part of a larger constellation of collaborative production efforts in the digital world. It's certainly been a pioneer and an infrastructure for cooperative production, but we want to explore here a lot of the offshoots and forms of socially created value in different areas of the world, outside of the marketplace, outside of the open source world, but often dependent upon it. Now, there's many manifestations of the digital commons these days. We have, of course, the wiki world and collaborative websites and social networking. There's all sorts of open business models and crowdsourcing. There's open access publishing. There's new semantic web collaborations going on. There's open data communities and much else. In a way, open platforms themselves are a form of commons, where you have shared protocols and understandings for developing common resources. So while each of these communities is different, they do embody certain principles of commons-based governance and knowledge management. And what we want to explore today are some of these shared rules for managing a commons. They tend to have certain legal structures for assuring that the fruits of the commons, what's produced within the commons by the commoners, stays within the commons, or at least can be managed by them according to their own wishes. And this, of course, is what the general public license and the Creative Commons licenses do. They're a way for controlling the fruits of the commons. But the commons also embody certain social protocols and norms for assuring quality production, coordinating work, and preventing people from abusing the commons. Now, it's helpful to know that there's really a literature on the commons that much of it was pioneered by Elinor Ostrom, a professor at the Indiana University, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for economics. And this was for her pioneering empirical work and analytic model building, studying how common pool resources work, especially natural resources in the developing world. And this was a very counterintuitive line of scholarship at a time when the rest of economics was focusing purely on individuals and their supposed rational self-interest. Ostrom hasn't studied too much the cultural and information commons, although she did collaborate with a colleague, Charlotte Hess, on a book called Understanding Knowledge as a Commons, which is a collection of essays focusing on a variety of different arenas, from open source, open access publishing to science as a commons, and I'm pleased to say that a number of people on the panel contributed to that book. And there's also a number of scholars and theorists of online commons, such as Lawrence Lessig and Yochai Benkler in his Wealth of Networks book, Jonathan Zittrain's Future of the Internet. And then I would also call to your attention a recently published book by Lewis Hyde called Common as Air, which makes the somewhat daring argument based on original historical research that the founding fathers of the United States were cultural commoners. I think my favorite chapter is the one called Ben Franklin, Founding Pirate, in which it describes him as working within collaborative networks to come up with his inventions of the lightning rod and the bifocal glasses, and how he didn't patent his inventions because he really knew that they were the product of a community. You might say that he was the original peer-to-peer networker. So in short, there's a common sector out there. In this panel, we want to explore some of its manifestations. Our first panelist is Beatriz Busaniche, who is a professor at the National University at Buenos Aires. She's a member of the Via Libre Foundation, and she's quite a prominent advocate for free and open source software in Latin America. And she'll be discussing how the self-organization and governance of FLOSS communities exemplify a commons-based approach, and how this is a social non-market mode of production that nonetheless can play nicely with the market. And she'll also talk about how this has inspired so much of the world of free culture. So, B?
Thank you very much. Thank you first for the invitation, and thank you, David, for organizing this panel. First of all, I would like to call your attention on what is happening in Latin America. Latin America is it's a very interesting place in the world, and the first thing I want to do is to express my solidarity with President Correa and the people from Ecuador. I don't know if you know what happened yesterday, but President Correa from Ecuador was kidnapped by the police. Thank God he's okay now. He's been rescued, and things are maybe going to normal. That's as far as I know. It's pretty hard to find news from Latin America here in Europe. Yesterday I tried to check what happened in Ecuador, and I couldn't find anything on television. So I was really worried, and I really think that we have to have more information regarding what is happening in Latin America, because not everything is bad in Latin America. And I want to express my solidarity with President Correa, because we've been talking about democracy this morning, and we are here in a free software event, and President Correa is one of the main supporters of free software and public administration. He's one of the leaders of Latin America's movement in free software, so he's someone who believes in the same things we do believe. So I would like to express my support to the peoples from Ecuador today, when they are living a really hard time, and we need to be more informed about that. We need more news about that kind of stuff happening in Latin America. But going to the topic, after all, I just wanted to mention this because there's nothing on the news or the newspapers here. Well, it looks pretty obvious saying that free software is a huge example of how the commons concept can help us build something that do not depend on a state and do not depend on market. In Latin America, the state has a huge role also. So I would like to focus on this self-organization we have as free software community, and not relying completely on the state or the market. In Latin America, we see the state as a very important actor. In fact, as maybe you've heard before, Brazil is one of the main actors, and well, India and other big countries. But in Latin America, there is a big movement supporting free software from the state, with Brazil as a main leader of this movement, but also Venezuela. Also, Ecuador is one of the most important. They have a huge process of adopting free software in public administration. That is a public policy for the whole public administration. So the state is a real important actor in this field in Latin America. So I would like to abort this issue, not just thinking about our relationship with the market, but also with the state. This self-organization we have has a constitution, as Philippe Agren already said this morning. And our constitution, we consider that our constitution is the GPL. As you may already noticed, I am a free software activist. I'm far away from the concepts of open source and that. I'm in this field because of the philosophy of the political impact of the free software. And so I share this view of the GPL as a constitution. You may think that this is something, an exaggeration. Is that okay? Is that a word? Sorry, English is not my mother's tongue, so it's hard to elaborate in a different language. But it is a model of how we do things. We thought, the first one who thought about that was Richard Stallman. But as Philippe showed this morning, by GPLB3, we had a participatory process to build our new constitution, our new license. And this license, we consider it as a constitution because it had a huge impact on other fields like Creative Commons, like other licenses. We don't deny the existence of our licenses by saying that this is our constitution. It is just the basic one. It's the first step. It's the step from where we then built our community. And this constitution will help us be some kind sure. I don't know if we will succeed, but we work on the path of thinking freedom as something very important for our movement. That is our commitment, freedom. So this license is developed to guarantee freedom in the future. So that single clause, the copyleft clause, is the one that guarantees that all our efforts, no matter why we do the efforts, there's people contributing to free software because of the money, because of the meritocracy, because they like it, because they learn, because whatever reason they have, we have something in common. We want this software to remain free. And this copyleft is the legal clause that will help us reach that goal. How do we establish our relationships with the market, other states, by being being autonomous? You can use free software for market. You can use free software for business. You can use free software for public administration. You can use whatever you do with free software, and that's what freedom means. But we are here for freedom. So we are independent of what uses people does with our software. It's free. So we don't completely rely on market, and we don't completely rely on states. Even while we need them, we need people working on free software. We need people doing business with free software, and we also need the state. Because every time we need to enforce the GPL, we have to go to the court, and that's part of the state. So we are related to all these instances in our society. But we have our own rules, and we have our own agreements, and we respect those agreements with this goal of freedom in mind. So that's what, and everybody can do whatever they want while we keep autonomous. So it's such a, I think it's an interesting movement for anthropologists or sociologists to study how we deal, because we have just few things in common. We don't share we don't share a religion, we don't share a political idea, we don't share a lot of things. Within the community, you will find a lot of different kind of people, a lot of different kind of interests, a lot of different kind of ideas, but we all share the idea of free software, freedom, free as in freedom. I think as soon as we have this in mind, we will remain autonomous, and that is something we could share with other movements. Since, well, free software has proved successful. Since a few days ago, on September, we've celebrated the 27th anniversary of the first message that Richard Stallman sent, saying that he would start working on the new project. That's 27 years ago. The Free Software Foundation was founded 25 years ago. The first GPL version was from 1989, and the second 1991, and the third is from 2006 or 7. And we proved successful. Everybody is talking about free software, even when they are naming it with another name, like open source, or as we have now a new movement in Latin America, coming especially from Brazil, which is intending to change the name to public software. which in Brazil, it's not a problem because they have a clear idea that public software means free software as public good, as I said already here. But that's not the same case in Argentina, for example. They are adopting the word public software, but they are not so sure about if it is or it's not exactly the same thing as free software. So whenever they try to call it, even open source is free software. The difference, the licenses are recognized by the open source initiative are almost the same with a, I don't know if maybe one difference, but I think it's almost the same licenses accepted by the Free Software Foundation. But whenever they, whatever they call it, it's free software. So free software has proved a successful movement. Everybody's talking about it now. And there are other movements trying to learn from our experience. First thing I have to say is that our experience is not completely replicable, is that okay, to other movements. Maybe we can, the thing we can compare is the Creative Commons licenses for other cultural goods, like music or like poems or whatever you write, or the Science Commons with this kind of licenses. But there's also people talking about adopting a copyleft model for seeds or for other things not related to copyright themselves. I think that's something maybe we can explore. Maybe the concept of the commons could put us together. I think the power of the concept of the commons is that can put in a dialogue all these different things that are pretty different, because seeds are really different than software, or water or air. They are really different things. But what we can share is our experience of self-organization, autonomy, and our relationship with the market and the state. Not a struggle against the market or a struggle against the state, but we can live together, but we can set a freedom sphere where we are sure that our goals will remain, no matter what. Well, at least that's what we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bea. We're going to have a question and answer at the end of all of our panelists, so please remember or write down your questions, and we'll have a little back and forth with the audience afterwards. Our next speaker is Michel Bauwens. He's a dear friend and a pioneer in founding the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, which is one of the more heavily retweeted sites on the web. Michel has been studying for many years the various types of peer production that occur in different contexts. And he's established a remarkable website and wiki, but more than that, an international network of people who are quite committed to these issues. So Michel will discuss the big picture economics of commons-based peer production and the new infrastructures of cooperation, why they're economically and socially compelling, and why they're often more competitive than conventional markets. He's also going to talk about the ongoing tensions and dance between capital and the commons, which is sometimes yielding a new paradigm of production, social production, and organizational forms. So, Michel?
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me. I actually speak French, but I will give the presentation in English. I consider myself a good friend of Paris because I have my children living in Montrouge. So I'm always happy to come here, and not just for professional reasons, but for family reasons. I want to start with just a few kind of historical notions that are, according to me, in our research community, closely related to what the emergence of free software means. And one of the first notions I'd like to introduce is what I call the 3 revolutions in human productivity. The first one, after the end of the tribal age, is basically the invention of coercion. So the first empires, kingdoms, are essentially based on coercive labor, on slavery, on attacking another people, and instead of killing them, enslaving them. It gets moderated in the second phase through serfdom, basically. But these are basically societies that are based on pure external motivation, fear. And I think the big revolution of capitalism, which I call the second revolution in human productivity, is the fact that it, instead of purely based on external negative motivation, start introducing self-interest as the basis of the economy. Of course, we know there is still coercion, but also there is this notion of exchanging value, equal value with each other, labor against money, a commodity against money, etc., etc. Now, I think that the big innovation that we see happening with free software as the first example of it is the notion of the third revolution of human productivity, which is based on voluntary self-aggregation. So for the first time here we have a mode of productivity which is based on the free aggregation of individuals, forming, let's say, the core of the value creation. And I'd like to make an even a stronger statement. What it means for me is that we've reached a stage of what I call peak hierarchy. I think until the moment that transaction costs, coordination costs, and communication costs were very high, as soon as we reached a social complexity above the what was called the Dunbar number, the small village level of the tribal age, we basically needed hierarchy to simplify communication. And the whole history and the drama of humankind is the history of bigger beating smaller. And of course, this has all kinds of consequences, how much social change can happen within a social entity when it's faced with danger from bigger players outside. I think what we see is that today when you see the Wikipedia, which of course has its own hierarchies and has certain problems, but is essentially based on this free aggregation, when it's out-competing and out-cooperating an established, well-financed group like the Britannica, that we can see the first inclinations of something different happening. In other words, what we are able to do now, and I believe free software is an example of that, is the global coordination, the global mutual coordination of small group dynamic efforts. The Wikipedia is not a centralized command and control system. It's a system of many, many individuals somehow coordinating their effort in a global artifact. And I think free software is another example of that, right? So we move from, let's say, knowledge cooperation to software cooperation, and I think we've reached the stage today of design cooperation. The big thing today on our wiki, the most popular page is our product hacking directory, which lists about 300 open hardware projects, about 24 open cars projects, open sailing projects. I mean, you name it. This is, for the last 3-4 years, we see this shift where this model of voluntary cooperation is becoming the core of the value creation. Now, that doesn't mean the market is disappearing, but I think there is a shift, an important shift. The market model that we know is a market model based on scarcity allocation, right? The market is actually a scarcity allocation mechanism. How do we allocate resources in a scarce world? Once you have a core which is ruled by logic of abundance, where the copying becomes marginal, then what we see is that the market moves from the core of the value creation to the periphery of the value creation. And basically the model that I see emerging, which is kind of the blueprint for free software, is quite simple to describe, I think, with 3 major players. So first of all, we have a core of people producing the commons, and they may be voluntary contributions, but of course increasingly, and as a project is successful like Linux, 75% of people are paid, but they remain within the logic of working for the GPL, increasing the commons. So we have a community, we have a collaborative platform, and we have a commons of knowledge, code, and design. And it is around that the entrepreneurial coalition forms, right? So basically, the abundance is not a market mechanism. You cannot have a supply and demand mechanism for something that is abundant. but you can create all kinds of scarcities, improve all kinds of things around the commons that are actually marketable commodities. And I think, even though we all know, especially if we are active in open sourceware, that it's not an easy thing to do, and that for the value we create, I believe it's about 2-3 years ago, it was $36 billion was the estimate for the open source business revenue generation. But at the same time, it was destroying $60 billion of the proprietary software market. So we know this is a problematic development. And the fair use report that came out a few months ago in the United States actually calculated the weight of this economy, the economy based on open content, open code, and open design, to 1/6 of the GDP of the United States. But what is pretty clear to me is that any traditional business model which tries to enclose that abundance, repress that abundance, in other words, proprietary software strategies, are not able to survive this new paradigm. Of course, I'm not saying this is happening from one day to another, but as a process, the freemium strategy, which is basically decommodifying the abundant part of the production, the open source free software strategy, which is about decommodifying the intellectual property of the value, and even more paradoxical for business people, the sharing economy like couchsurfing, where both the intellectual property and the service itself are free, are inescapable competitors that are emerging and basically kind of destroying the very basis of cognitive capitalism, right? We know that once the West became non-competitive in the industrial field 25 years ago, we chose the path of increasing intellectual property and basing our whole strategy on the basis of intellectual property. And this is the thing that is being destroyed, I think, through the free software commons. Already we see, if you look at the emerging countries like China, 40% of the Chinese economy is actually based on illegal open design. The Shanzai economy is an illegal version of what we're talking about, right? They're sharing designs. They're building a very strong and vibrant economy on basis on this fact. I'm also not sure if you read recent books that appeared. I forgot the title, but there's a book about why did Germany, which was very backwards in 1850, in 30 years' time became almost as strong as the UK, which was the leading power at the late 19th century. And the answer of this book is very clear. It's IP. IP destroyed the competitiveness of the UK. They only published 10,000 books, while in Germany they produced 100,000 books with scientific and technical innovation, based on the absence of IP. So I think, so we have the commons, collaborative community, and the platform. We have the entrepreneurial coalition. And I think another innovation that we have in the free software model is the emergence of for-benefit associations, right? What we see is that even though the community might still be self-directed and adding value to the commons, that the infrastructure of the cooperation is usually managed by some kind of foundation. The Apache Foundation, the GNOME Foundation, the Perl Foundation. And so this is basically the model that we see emerging within the free software field. And that seems to be a viable model. Because what happens, of course, is that the entrepreneurial coalition starts hiring people, working for the commons, and in the commons at the same time supports the for-benefit foundations as well. And the key, I think, becomes what is the exact relationship then between the community who wants, as you stress, maintain a maximum amount of freedom and autonomy, and the for-profit sector, which is in the game of profit maximization. How does exactly that thing is working? And I don't know how much time I still have left, 2 or 3 minutes. So I would like to say that what I see happening today is the following, and I know it's early days, but I think this is kind of pointing towards the future. So the classic model that we had of a pure corporate entity is profit maximization, right? The neoliberal age is you make money and you don't really care about anything else. Those are externalities that we don't really care about in our transaction, our business transactions. And I think this is not a viable model. We are pretty much, I think, in the same historical situation as at the end of the Roman Empire. What was the problem then? The problem then was power maximization. So all these emperors were basically intent on power maximization, and they auto-divined themselves, so they became divine rulers. And we all know what kind of pathologies that generated in those civilizations. So the big revolt of the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, was an attempt to enclose, if you like, to limit the power maximization and its destructive effects on society. And I think we pretty much were the same situation now. We have a system which destroys a biosphere, which doesn't take into account many social externalities. And so we need a system whereby profit maximization can be enclosed and limited in its power to destroy and dislocate society. And I think this is what free software also means. It means that not just like before, the industrial paradigm is we enclose the profit system within the state, right? State regulations come from the outside. What we now have strong communities with cultural norms, with constitutions and social charters, which force companies like IBM, when it's turning to free software and Linux, to somehow adapt itself to these new cultural values. And so it's no longer a purely external threat or influence. It's actually something that needs to be embedded in a new DNA of a new type of companies. And I think, I'll close with that, is that we are at the verge of another change. So now we have already pretty much established a model where we have community-oriented businesses. That's what we have now with free software. We see companies orienting themselves toward this new field and adapting to these new social demands. What I think we need, and I think we're working on it, is communities that create a new type of business, a new type of corporation, a new type of entity that allows communities to sustain their value system and create enterprises that are more in tune. And I would call this a preferential treatment to working as a community, as free software developers, as open designers and knowledge creators with those type of entities that are maximally aligned to the new value system that is represented by the Free Software Commons. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel, for that bracing vision. I hope we have some questions about that. Our next speaker is John Wilbanks, who is something of a Renaissance man who has worked for a member of Congress, started a bioinformatics company, studied at the Sorbonne, done software development at the Berkman Center at Harvard University, and was a fellow at the World Wide Web Consortium. In 2003, he founded and now runs Science Commons, which is an offshoot associated with Creative Commons, where John is also vice president. So John is going to describe some of the work of the Science Commons in trying to adapt commons-based innovations to promote faster, better, more effective, more efficient research. And this is taking a variety of different forms, but I'll let John explain that.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm going to come in a little bit between Michel and Beatriz, I think, which is I'm going to start with what is it that enabled this sort of decentralized political act, and to me it's the network. And the network sort of teaches us that the architecture of open, if it's built in at the very beginning, allows for unexpected uses of systems. So the network was not designed to enable free software or Wikipedia. The network was designed to connect 3 computers in a bureaucrat's office in Washington, D.C., J.R. Licklider. But the choice that the engineers made was to make that connectivity open so that computers that were not yet part of the system could be connected. And that enabled over the 1970s and the early 1980s, as the personal computers emerged and you stopped having to be at a university to have access to a computer, you could connect those computers to the network, and the network could extend. You could get protocols like email, as well as file transfer protocols and messaging protocols. And that led to the creation and the deployment of the World Wide Web, which was essentially recapitulated most of the design elements of the network. It allowed for the connection of unexpected protocols, the creation of unexpected content, and at no point was permission required to add a new server or a new page. And this was actually very different than the other hypertext systems that were available at the same time as the World Wide Web. HyperCard on the early Apple Macs being a good example. So this architecture of open in the network was about extensibility and not having to ask permission first. I think that's the context into which the GPL really exploded. And so the GPL took that and said, what we're going to have in addition to that is a guarantee of freedom. And so to the extent that there's a constitution of the GPL, it's this guarantee of freedom. And when you put together the guarantee of freedom with the decentralization that allows individuals to connect to each other without going through that hierarchy, then you get these sort of remarkable knowledge products being generated. And software is sort of a new form of knowledge product. We haven't had it for 350 years. And so to me, it was a little more, the systems that were protecting software were less entrenched than the systems that protect scholarly journals, for example. The invisible college of publishers of software didn't have the power over tenure and granting that you have in other classes of knowledge product creation. And then you sort of get on top of this, you get Wikipedia, which is an example of an old knowledge product, an encyclopedia being disintermediated through the same sort of set of processes. And what I would sort of close in this first bit is that no one was really watching when the internet was created, and no one was really watching when the web was created, and no one was really watching when Stallman started free software. And when Wikipedia got going, there was still sort of a belief that the internet was this thing where you went to find pictures of cats, right? And what's different now is that everyone now believes open is a credible alternative in terms of business models. And so one of the largest threats you're going to see is the emergence of half-open or fake open systems, Open API being one of my favorite examples, which attempt to erode, right, to get some of the benefits of generativity without giving the freedom or the extensibility that sit inside the network and the web. And Facebook is a great example of this. Twitter is a great example of this. The entire Apple ecosystem is a great example of this. And what you see is that people will willingly give up their rights, their freedoms, and their extensibility if the objects are integrated, bright, and shiny enough. Right, I've seen, there's a lot of iPads on planes these days. So that's sort of where I wanted to start, is this idea that the architecture of systems is really, really at the core of whether or not they're open, whether or not they form a commons. And part of that is software-based, part of that is philosophical, and part of that is legal. But none of it is necessary in the sense that it's not inevitable that systems will be open architecture, that systems will be free. Open is a choice at this point. And we have to always sort of think about how closed systems are going to react in an evolutionary context in ways that threaten open systems. That's sort of point one. Point two is that so far copyrights have sort of been the boundary zone of open for the most part, at least in the context of open source software and free culture and so forth. Lewis's book does a beautiful job of showing other things, but in the modern context, in the network context, these things tend to be digital objects which tend to have copyrights. Now, copyrights have some unique characteristics. They're relatively international. They are enabling in the sense of if I write down what I've written here and give it to you, I've given you all the rights you need to do stuff with it. Right? I can give you the right to make derivative works and no one else can stop you. I can transfer all of those rights to you. Right? I can fully enable you to make a derivative work, to make a copy, to display and perform publicly. And because of the network, you can make copies relatively painlessly. But that's not really representative of the vast majority of knowledge products that are useful in this world and that represent the potential boundaries of the commons. So Eben Moglen, who is one of the original legal scholars who worked on the GPL, has this great paper, and it was in 1999, called Anarchism Triumphant. I'd strongly recommend it. If you Google it, you can find it. And he talked about Moglen's laws, right? And these are corollaries to physical laws. And so one of them is that if you wrap the world in internet and spin it, that free software comes down the wire. This is a corollary, I believe, to Ohm's law. But his second sort of corollary was that it's not about sort of the motivation of why the free software comes down the wire. The question is, what's the resistance in the wire to free software moving through it? And he hypothesized that the resistance is directly proportional to the field strength of intellectual property in the wire. So copyright is a strong international system which created strong resistance in the wire to free software coming after the internet, and the GPL was about lowering the resistance in the wire. What we've learned in the science project at Creative Commons is that, ironically, it's the power of copyright that makes copyleft work. And so in places where you don't have an international, powerful, harmonious IP regime, it's actually fairly hard to invert it and turn it into something like copyleft. And one of the ironies of the success of free software and of Creative Commons is the naivete with which we all often say, well, we want open source, and then you fill in the blank. We want open source hardware. We want open source seeds. We want open source stem cells. And because those things are often not digital and not copyrightable, that turns out to be a lot more complicated to do. And we can actually create real problems by propagating the norms, the memes, and the legal tools from free software and free culture naively into these other spaces. And this is the lesson I've been learning year and year and year and year again at Science Commons. So, and a good example place to start would be data. So data seems like a natural candidate for a free culture, copyleft style approach. But it turns out that the very legal tool copyleft, which works in copyright because copyright's strong international and so forth, is a real problem in interoperability of data. Because you don't have a unanimous international regime on how copyright affects data. On top of that, you have a variety of international regimes that add extra rights to data, most of which are weak and national. You create a system where an attempt to port copyleft culture to data actually prevents the very emergence of a network effect in data that might eventually allow us to have a copyleft approach in data. So if we had copyleft on the original network protocols, if we had copyleft on the original web, that may well have increased the costs enough over public domain approaches that we wouldn't have gotten network effects. And so we're having to battle in many ways the idea that freedom comes from legal tools as opposed to from the public domain in data. Because the field strength of the intellectual property is weak, using intellectual property to overcome resistance is actually not effective. And that's something that we're still having to fight that fight, not just against the people who want data to be closed, but against people who agree with us that data should be open over the actual tools that should get used. And then beyond that, you have all of these other infrastructure issues around freedom that have been solved in copyright software, that have been solved in copyright culture, things like names. Right? We have the URL and the domain name system that allows us to locate sourceforge.org, that allows us to locate software packages. We don't have a domain name system that functions for databases nearly as effectively, for the entities inside databases. You very quickly wind up having arguments that remind me of my undergraduate training in philosophy about what things mean and what they should be named that have not been solved yet, that are much more important than IP for creating the commons of data. What does it mean to preserve data? We have a system that Jean-Claude has studied extensively that preserves the scholarly record through citation. We have no similar norms and cultures for preserving and citing data, and much less the sort of economics of how we're going to store data for 100, 200, 300 years in any sort of context that allows it to become part of the record. Data is actually easy compared to things like stem cells and seeds. Stem cells and seeds are inherently non-digital. They need to be manufactured. They need to be maintained. They have temperatures and feeding. They have none of the aspects of sort of long-tail network economics. They require institutions and state funding to be maintained as public goods and public resources, at least until we get into a world where businesses see a value in providing them as an open resource as opposed to an artificially scarce resource. Your legal tools there are often have no IP on which to resort. If someone hasn't filed for a patent, which is expensive to do, then you're dealing primarily with trade secrets and contract theory, which is again inherently not international. Trade secrets and the commons are sort of diametrically opposed to each other. How do you create systems where people see enough of a value in behaving in a decentralized open way that they unilaterally adopt that approach, or that perhaps they're incented, to be a nice word, by the funders and by the governments to do that? And you start to deal with patents at this point. Patents are inherently different than copyrights. They are not enabling, they're exclusionary. Even if you get a patent, you don't have the right to practice it. So if I have a patent and I give it to Beatriz, if Jean-Claude has a blocking patent, she can't practice. This is completely different than the way copyright works, right? Imagine if Microsoft could block you from doing Linux, right, at every single step because they had rights that predated yours. And that's what you're dealing with in the patent space. The cost of getting a patent makes giving away the patent in a viral fashion somewhat prohibitive. So it's a totally different world. Now, there are commons approaches that can work in data and in seeds and in patents, but they may well look very different than the commons approaches that we've come to depend on in free software and free culture. And in many cases, when you're dealing with maker communities, things like open source hardware, you have issues that are totally unrelated to intellectual property, like safety. So I was at the Open Hardware Summit last week in New York, and one of the primary questions with things like cars or with drone airplanes is who is responsible for safety? In a hierarchical system, there's a safety inspection that goes out before you're allowed to manufacture and sell a car to a consumer. But in a DIY, bottom-up culture, that's sort of pushed off onto the user, and it's like it's your fault if you don't install the brakes correctly, and you create a wreck where you kill 50 people. And if you think about this problem and you scale it to pharmaceuticals, it becomes a real issue, which is that we just don't have the cultural institutions to deal with this yet. The nice thing is that these are places where there is so little belief the commons can work that I would say no one is watching and we actually have a chance. Because the closed systems are they're too big and too crusty to change. Whereas in software and in some of the knowledge products, the reactions that create these, what my friend John Phillips calls FOPEN, right, faux open systems, are actually dangerous. But in the big space, they just don't have the capacity to react. So that's the good news. Okay, so to take away a couple of points, I do believe that these decentralized systems, inherently because of the internet, function better than closed top-down systems in the creation of knowledge. And they can do this in areas that are currently considered too complex for them to work, like stem cells or pharmaceuticals, but only if we get the design right. They're not going to work magically, and they're not going to work because they're open. They'll work because they're designed in a way that allows them to grow. And they will work to the extent that the ability to generate knowledge, combine knowledge, and practice that knowledge is decentralized and democratized as well. So when we look at pharmaceutical or car building or what have you, the reason those are beginning to be vulnerable to a commons-based approach is because the capacity to do that is being democratized. I can buy a sequencer on eBay. I can get genes synthesized for 50 cents a letter at mrgene.com. Right? I can go to the MIT Registry of Standard Biological Parts and download standard biological bits of DNA and program bacteria. It looks an awful lot like computers in the early 1970s. And the question is whether or not the emerging commons in that space will have enough extensibility and enough freedom built into it that decentralization is able to scale in a way that competes with the closed hierarchical systems. It can. It doesn't mean that it will. The second is that these different knowledge products inherently need different commons implementations. We cannot simply look at free software and free culture and say we should create that exact thing in data. We should create that exact thing in stem cells. We should create that exact thing in patents. Not only will those systems not work, they will create antibodies against the commons. When people say, well, I tried open and it didn't work. And that in many ways is one of the greatest barriers that we have to face is people who think they tried an open system even though they didn't and have written it off. We have to wait until those people change jobs or change roles in the funding agencies to get another chance. And I'm not sure we have time. I mean, given what we're doing to the biosphere, given what we're doing in terms of wealth inequality in this world, I'm not sure we have another 15 years to take advantage of the opportunity we have today. So that gets to my last point, which is that software as a commons, free cultural commonses, have come about because of very clear choices that have been made by software engineers, by architects, by lawyers, by producers, by entrepreneurs. And if we don't constantly articulate the fact that this is a choice, the reasons why as a choice it's important, and why it's important to make the choices correctly in the various spaces, then there's a very good chance that the combined set of threats to the commons, which are the false open models, closed models and incorrect implementation of the commons in different spaces, right, that's actually a lot of resistance in the wire. And if we don't address that correctly and systematically by constantly framing this as a choice that people have to make, a choice that is very enabling, a choice that is capable of coexistence with the market, and a choice that inherently lets us produce knowledge more quickly and more equitably, then I think that it's easy for the center to lose hold. It's very easy for the various motivations that draw people into this to actually draw us apart instead of drawing us together. So as we think about the commons, I just wanted to sort of keep hammering away that it's a choice, not inevitable, and it really does matter how we implement in the various spaces. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Our final speaker is Jean-Claude Guidon, who will provide us with an overview and scope in the current state of open access publishing, which, as some of you may know, is a quite robust area of commons, which also has its own challenges. So, Jean-Claude?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'll start with two extraneous remarks, which have nothing to do with my talk. I would like to show my solidarity with Beatriz with regard to what's happening in Ecuador. I think she's quite right to underscore the information problems we have to get news about such events, and that reflects a certain world order that obviously the commons should really help alleviate. The second one is an amused reaction to the program of this conference. I tried yesterday to attend a so-called Open CIO summit, but I hadn't seen the padlock. I'll let you meditate about the padlock for an Open CIO summit. There is some oxymoric thinking going on in this conference, but I will not elaborate on that. Actually, I'm not going to speak all that much about open access. I will bring open access only as a way to support some ideas. I'd like to move let's say, a notch or two higher than that, and in a sense, concur a great deal with my three colleagues in the process. One thing that seems to have been missing, in my opinion, about this whole commons issue is what kind of individual are we talking about? We use the word individual very quickly. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Beatriz talked to us about the need to build some sort of autonomy with regard to both the state on the one hand and the market on the other hand. Michel talked to us about the free aggregation of individuals, and again he gave us individuals. Let me simply bring back also some historical background to this issue. The individual is really a concept that was gradually, very gradually built up as a way to resist and in fact completely subvert an earlier order of things where coercion, power, slavery, but more or less any kind of feudal system can be kept in mind. And the individual was building his own legitimacy on a very specific concept, associated concept to that of individual, which is that of property. That is the issue of someone having possessions and thereby being able to demonstrate one's existence in the world. C.B. Macpherson, a political science philosopher from the University of Toronto, about 60 years ago, wrote a very, very important book on this whole issue called The Philosophy of Possessive Individualism. And when we talk about individuals really in our world, we tend to think mainly in terms of a possessive individual. And if the issue of property nowadays and copyright and similar issues are so much at the center of those debates, it's precisely because perhaps the whole issue of property and the whole issue of individual is being submitted to challenges that have not been yet explicated well enough at this point in history. What we see in the networks that Jean mentioned. When we look at the autonomy that Beatriz was talking, or the free aggregation of individuals that Michel told us about, I think we're seeing something a bit different. We're not seeing an individual that has, to use a philosophical jargon, has an atomistic form. It's not an autarkic individual. It's not someone that has properties. In fact, even in physics, atoms have properties. The pun is there, but there is something deeper behind that pun. The point is that in those networks, people really are trying to exist in a little bit different way. They're not trying to possess so much as they try to distinguish themselves from others. The whole point of being in a software commons, the whole point of doing open access, the whole point of trying to create anything at all is really, first and foremost, an attempt to distinguish oneself. Another way of putting it differently would be to use Bourdieu, the French sociologist, vocabulary of symbolic capital. You want to create something that symbolically is meaningful to those you want to deal with in a game of creating distinctions. What is, I think, happening in this period in history is really a deep shift in what the whole issue of individualism is. I think it is saying things like the economic modeling of the atomistic individual with rational self-interest is not sufficient. It's very incomplete, and we need to build a better, fuller modeling of what human beings are about. In other words, create a different vision of individualism. And if we go back to the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages and so on, in effect, we've been working on this notion of individualism ever since, which means also that we are part of a very deep, long process which is not obviously finished, which is not going to finish tomorrow, but which has to be understood. We have, in effect, to complete. Perhaps we can never complete it. Maybe we should strive to a horizon which is that of democracy, which is also recognizing that we don't have democracy yet. David seems to like Franklin a great deal, both in his book, wonderful book, by the way, David, and Viral Spiral. And this morning he mentioned Franklin again. Franklin, I think, was asked by a lady, David recounts in his book, that said, so what do we have now, a monarchy or a republic? And I think Franklin, if I recall the terms correctly, said, it's a republic if you can keep it, or something to that effect. And the point of that is there was a slight mistake in Franklin. He was close to what I think is the truth, but he should have said, yes, it's a republic if we can keep on moving in that direction. We are not there yet. And when we talk nowadays about saving democracy in the world, this is silly. We don't even have it ourselves. We are moving in that direction. We have elements of democracy in our societies. We don't have a democratic society yet. I think plenty of events, recent events in the last couple of years would quickly underscore that. The Wall Street financiers, I'm sure, would disagree deeply with what I'm saying right now, because they need the discourse of property and democracy and so on to keep things in place. So what we're seeing, in effect, is a deep challenge to both notions such as the state and the market. The network actually is the alternative to the market. The state may be renamed some other way someday, but I don't think that's so important, but it's certainly going to have to play different roles in the future. We need some sort of governance and state, so we have to build that, and we need some sort of interaction among human beings, and the network is obviously providing very important and interesting models in that direction, but we still have to build all of this. Now, curiously enough, but it's important to recall that, and that's where perhaps open access can give us some interesting examples, the natural scientists in the 17th century were actually trying to build something of a networked knowledge community. Well, it turned out that they were, gentlemen and really privileged members of society, and behind their mind, they wanted to keep that among themselves. But the thing eventually began to spread and bring about a system which, without being completely open and democratic, has obviously gained has made some steps in the right direction. The whole open access issue is really to correct some of the perversions and subversions of that system, to bring back a free exchange of ideas among the people who purport to discover the reality of nature, what I like to call restoring the possibilities of the grand conversation, which is the way for anyone who is so capable to read other people's work, to discuss with other people about their work, and to build upon those works. So we have there a model which in fact was very much behind Stallman when he developed his reaction to the closing of software in the 80s and brought about the beginning of the free software movement. But what was left really untold, including by luminaries whom I respect enormously, by the way, such as Yochai Benkler, is this question of the individual. The individual remains an unspoken element in this kind of system as it is being described now, and we have to move in the direction of creating this new individual. Now, how do you exist in this networked world? The model I like to use to describe it is that of the linguistic concept of the phoneme. The phoneme is very interesting as a concept. You probably know that the phoneme is the basic sound, or the set of the basic sounds of any language as you speak it. I'm trying right now to make English phonemes with limited success, I suspect, but I do my very best. The phoneme is interesting because it also accounts for the fact that someone from Scotland may understand someone from South Africa if they both speak English, and yet you can be extremely sure that they won't make the same sounds. If I use a French example, since I live in Montreal, you will, and there are probably a number of Frenchmen here in this room, the word neige in French will appear as neige in Montreal, yet it doesn't prevent communication. The phoneme allows doing that. It doesn't create a kind of fixed, property-based ontological definition of the essence of the phoneme. Therefore, the phoneme is not an atom, but like an atom, the phoneme is individualized. And what makes it really work, the phoneme, is that it maintains specific sets of oppositions to other peer entities, other phonemes. In other words, does the B, as in Spanish, does it really oppose itself to V or not? Well, for most Spanish-speaking ears, it's ambiguous at best. Quite often it's confused. In French and English, we hear B, V, B, V. There is no problem. The phoneme works with these kinds of oppositional rules, which means that you exist in comparison with your peers. You exist in ways of distinguishing with your peers. So that when you talk about a society which is moving towards a higher level of democracy through the models given by science, by open access, by free software, you're asking about creating a kind of individual that is going to require the right to distinction. It's the right to be distinguishable from others and yet relate to others through that distinction. That's the tricky part. You're different from the others. You don't want to be like everybody else, but you don't want to be totally crazy either and be relegated to the alien world. You want to be able to discuss with people. You want to debate. You want to refine. You want to even struggle, fight, and so on. So you create in this fashion a dynamic society which keeps on moving through the building of distinctions, what you might call creative distinctions. And Creative Commons is what you need to create creative distinctions. I don't know how much more time I have. Close, okay. So I'll close more or less because I think it's better to keep the discussion going now between us and all of you people. We're in the same group, we're peers. We need to therefore think about governance in terms of that kind of individuality. We need to think about production in that kind of system where people get their symbolic advantages as well as their the ability to make full use of their creative powers. And we need to essentially work on, at least putting oneself next to, or perhaps in opposition to, market values, which are definitely based on an atomistic individual system. That was my attempt at a contribution this morning.
Well, I want to thank all 4 panelists for some tremendously provocative and thoughtful ideas. I'd like to open it up now to the audience. Perhaps I could get a volunteer to run a mic around to speak into the mic so everybody could hear, but I invite you to pose any questions to our panelists.
Just on that last intervention, it's very interesting because there's, if you look at social networks and the friend of a friend ontology, for example, it's all about relationships, creating relationships between people. And what you're creating is a web of trust in which you can identify people mostly not as individual atoms, but as relationships, as positioning in a web of a social network. So, and that's really where we can get back to what Morgan is speaking about. If you can create a distributed social web that is completely decentralized, you get that vision, and it's feasible, and it's really the thing that we need to build next.
Thank you for your comment. If I may just say one very simple thing I forgot to say. The end of all this is that we have to think about aiming not at producing things, but at producing processes.
The one irony in all of this, of course, is that it takes a very small number of relationships for a corporation to identify you as an individual. So in the United States, your name is not important. Your zip code, your birthday, and your gender identify 87% of the United States uniquely as individuals. So the danger in these relationship systems is the fact that we have an entire business culture, at least in the United States, dedicated to individualizing you in order to sell you property. And this is part of that resistance to the open system that's not necessarily coming from where we expect, that we have to think about when we design.
Go ahead, Michel.
Yes. I think one way to, I resonate a lot with, with phonemic individualism. One way that I try to understand this new dynamic is the move from community-based social systems, pre-modern, basically where the individual is subsumed through his role, pretty fixed roles in a community as father, mother, elder, lord, or whatever, to the system of individualism, atomistic individualism, which we have known, based on the idea that we need a social contract and institutions to be socialized, to, I think the key word is relationality. I think what we're building now, the networks, is building relationality, is enhancing, enabling individualism through relationality. But I think what is still missing is a new form of community, right? We have local communities in pre-modern times. We have the nation state as an imagined community in modernity. And we do not have really yet a new type of way of identifying ourselves as a community. I'm in touch with an interesting bunch of Spanish guys who talk about philes, P-H-Y-L-E-S. And what they're trying to do is recreate network identities pretty much in the same way as the guilds did at the end of the Middle Ages, Florence and Venice. So I think this is an interesting direction of thinking. I just want to mention a little anecdote because this is quite interesting for me. I already mentioned many times in my own lectures that when I meet young people in Amsterdam, for example, they're no longer identified by their job. Nobody's telling me like, I work for Microsoft or Nokia. It just doesn't come up in the conversation. What comes up is, I'm doing free software. I'm doing this project. I'm doing that project. And almost their job is seen as a adjunct. It's just what they need to do in order to be able to be engaged in their creative pursuit. And actually, even to the point where I met somebody yesterday, who found a well-paid job in a telco, and he was sad about it. It was a defeat. It meant he hadn't succeeded another way of living his creative life and working for that company. Well, okay, I'll probably earn twice as much money, but I'm not going to be happy within that set of institutional constraints. And just to finish with another anecdote, I was in Helsinki last week, and there was a lady from a startup, and she said, you know what? I cannot find anybody, not any individual who wants to work for me 5 days a week. Everybody's asking for a 3 or 4 day working week because they want to do their stuff. And so, in other words, it's the Googleization of work, right? Where already in Google they adapted this model of 1 day a week. But so this is, my feeling is this is going from a marginal phenomenon to really a new way of how young people see themselves and are building their identities through their contributions. And just to finish, I'm sorry, I kind of have a hard time finishing. So the idea is, okay, we had a fixed identity which got fragmented through postmodern developments, but I think we are reuniting our various fragments through common projects. So I think this is a very important role that commons have to recreate some kind of unity in our kind of disturbed hyper-individualism.
Thank you, Michel. Be quickly and
just something very short. I want to remark how important is building communities regarding commons. We cannot talk about commons without talking about communities. They are really, there are strong relationships between that. It's like talking about Creative Commons without talking about the communities behind that, or talking about free software without talking about the communities. And these communities are are particular ones. They are not the same kind of communities we've known in history, like the peoples from I don't know, but they are some new kind of communities. I think based on this kind of individual that Jean-Claude was talking about. But I think they are two related, completely related concepts. We cannot talk about commons without talking about communities.
It helps to remember that a commons is not just the physical object or resource. It's the resource, it's the people and their relationships, and it's the social protocols and values they have. So that the commons has to be understood as that entity and not just the resource. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Right there.
Yeah, I'm curious about in many ways the absence of the state in this discussion. The state is a very powerful actor, and it casts a big shadow on the commons. I come from India, and here in India, the state is the big gorilla sitting there and determining what the commons can do and cannot do. Now, there are some enlightened actors within the let's say if you break up the state, who will be more sympathetic to the views of this panel, but others may not be. So if I may elicit some comments on this. Thank you.
Michel, I know, has something in B. Michel?
I think this is a very pertinent remark. I personally think we need civil society, which for me is the main actor of the commons. Autonomous production of social value through civil society. We still need a market for dealing with scarce resources. But we also need an entity that takes care of the common good, because I think that, as much as I like the commons are also selfish, right? The Sky Commons, if it would exist, cares about the sky. The Free Software Commons cares about Linux or developing whatever it is they are developing. And so we still need some kind of collective entity that takes care of, let's say, the commonality of our social life. But I do think we're facing a serious crisis of the state. What I see happening is that the nation state is slowly losing significance. Even the European Union is not able to withstand the global financial predatory system. So we are really faced with a problem of the state, right? Now, a positive notion I'd like to advance is a notion of what I call the partner state. In other words, I do think that the welfare state is a good model, but is a historically dated model. And it still has very much this notion, I think, of a state providing services to subjects, right? And I think we have to turn that around. This is why, for example, I use for-benefit association instead of non-profit or non-governmental, because why would we define ourselves as lacking, compared to these other two players, right? No, we are creating value, we are constituting new realities and lives, but we still need the state as or an entity that takes care of the commonality. For example, if you look at the UK, I think it's a very big problem there. They talk about a big society, the Conservatives, right? But they are destroying all the public services that enable and empower big society communities to emerge. And I think this is a kind of very contradictory approach. So the partner state for me is an example is, and I'll close with that. I don't know if Michel Briand is here or not, but this is a very nice experiment in Brest in France, where the city is enabling the communities to enhance, they're called smuggling routes, and they're used a lot by tourists, by creating all kinds of added value. And the city has provided computers that people can rent. They have their own server space, their own YouTube, their own Flickr. They do training, education, and the result is a very vibrant community life that enhances the value not just of the social life of the city, but attracts tourists to that particular place. So the partner state is a state that enables and empowers social production to occur, and I think this is the direction we need to see the state in. So I was talking about the market adapting, but the state certainly needs just as much effort to adapt to these new realities.
B, do you have a quick point?
Well, I think it's interesting to have different points of view and share your concern regarding the state issue. It's something the first thing I've said at the beginning, that the state has a very important role, especially when we come from other parts of the world, from Latin America, for example. I think this is one of the most interesting things we'll have in our next meeting in Berlin next month in November, and which is that we'll have people from 35 countries, from different regions in the world. So because the point of view regarding state and market are quite different. Coming from Latin America, I see a very, and most of the commons discussion comes from the north. And we have really a different perspective. In Latin America, the state is a very important actor. But after the last decades, it proved that it failed as the only administrator. If of the commons, I mean, if the state has a monopoly, it failed. Then in Argentina, we had in the 1990s, the neoliberalism took the power in the whole Latin America, and we tried exactly the opposite. We privatized also the radio spectrum. We were the first country that had privatized the radio spectrum in the world. So we tried both things, the state and the market. And now we are rethinking the public goods, we are rethinking the role of the state, and we prove enough of the market. In Argentina, as you may already know, we had a huge crisis in 2001, and we survived, and we are here, and we are alive now. But that was a consequence of an extremist market-oriented policy, which was the answer to an extremist state-oriented policy. So now I think we have to think beyond those models, and without struggling against them, but trying to build our community organizations, civil society organizations that, how do I say that? I have the idea in Spanish, but I'm finding it hard to translate it into English. But we need civil society to control the market and the state to promote our own interests. And this concept of the commons could be a good idea to reinforce the power of civil society in front of these both different kind of policies which have proven wrong. Both the state and the market can't deal with the water, with the air, with the public service as a whole. With the software, it is clear that they can't. With the culture, there are many different issues we have to talk about and make decisions as a society, as these kind of individuals Jean-Claude was talking about, as communities. So we have to try to self-organize and be autonomous of this, in front of the state and in front of the market.
John has a quick remark, and then we're going to take one more question, and we'll go ahead.
So just a quick reaction, which is that if you think back to the emergence of railroads and steamships in the mid-1800s, which created a unique ability to travel, right? What emerged as an innovation was the corporation. It was Vanderbilt in the United States invented the modern mega corporation. And it was something that could negotiate with the state in a way that the state was comfortable with. And one of the hard things about decentralized systems is that they're decentralized, and so they don't create a thing with a leader with whom the state can engage. Even though there's often a hunger for that. So I mean, we've had meetings at Creative Commons where 500 people will gather from around the world in a remote city, and it's fantastic and spectacular, but it doesn't result in an entity that can negotiate with the state. And so the very decentralized nature of this and the leaderless nature of this makes it difficult, because then both the state and the individuals look to organizations like Creative Commons often to be quote-unquote leaders with whom they can negotiate. But we're much more like a standards body than the leader of the movement, because there is no single movement. There are photographers, there are musicians, there are scientists. And we create standard tools that they can use, but there's this frustration because the state's used to negotiating with hierarchical entities. And so until we get the states to a level more like Michel is talking about, it's going to be hard to have that sort of engagement. And think about the web. The web has the World Wide Web Consortium, which writes the standards for HTML. But we have the Internet Governance Forum and the World Summit on the Information Society to talk about civil engagement that uses those tools. We have no analog on the Commons side with the IGF and the World Summit.
One more question, and I'd like to note for everyone that there will be a Knowledge Commons workshop this afternoon at 2 o'clock in the Amsterdam room. So any of you who are interested in carrying on this conversation and interacting with some but not all of these panelists, plus Felipe Gran, who will be joining us, please join us at 2. But in the meantime, one more question.
Okay. I would like to get back to one point that Michel pointed out about the necessity to build new communities. And your historic point of view was very interesting, but one very important and even critical element in the building of this historic community is the storytelling component. It's the way that, for instance, France as a nation has been built by government and historian claiming that at one point this is the official history of this nation, and this is why we can act as a nation. And even sometimes telling lie or rewriting stuff. And with the new rising communities coming from the open world, sometimes I do have trouble to find the storytelling part. You already have to be part of it or interested to actually get committed. I don't feel yet the sense that people who are not close to those communities yet can find an intrigue, which is basically people telling what they're doing and what they're doing about, even reinventing that part. So don't you think the storytelling component that actually, to me, is very important in the definition of a community, especially a new one, might be missing?
Maybe I'm not the one that should answer first, but what I think the best answer to your question, which is a very good question, is to go back to what I said perhaps a bit cryptically. We have to go from a world of static things, products, results, to a world of processes. Storytelling about one's community is, of course, the basic stuff of democracy. Battles about what we are about and how we describe ourselves and how we narrate ourselves is very much part of how we build our identities. But if you look at them as processes and not as products or objects and such, then you start saying what are the best ways to make sure that the flow of possibilities in telling stories can be maximized. You know, and that's an entirely different project from fixing the meaning of Joan of Arc, for example, for the French. You know, something like that. It's an entirely different vision also of putting your own identity at stake inside the historical process. You become far more, to use very, very rarefied philosophical language, you become far more Heraclitean at that point, and you really, really are happy to put your foot in a river which is never the same.
Yes, I think actually this is one of the key problems. You know, if you look at history, communities had their mythologies, right? Like in India, I understand like every caste has its own set of divinities and stuff. And I had an interesting conversation yesterday with a really interesting French guy called Remy Suzan, who studies transhumanism. And he was saying, well, transhumanism is actually one of those mythologies used by the hacker class, right? The singularity is kind of the apocalypse. And it gives them like a common belief, you know, that technology will solve everything. So this is kind of a proto-story that is emerging out of these communities. But I think it's also linked to economic survival. I think most networks are transient because people... The Wikipedia is collectively sustainable. Linux is collectively sustainable as long as they can replace people who leave with people who come in. But the individual today in this type of society cannot sustainably volunteer, you know, and self-aggregate on a long-term basis. So I think that's a difficulty, and I think we need to work not just on the storytelling, but also on some economic mechanisms that can kind of stabilize at least the core of those network organization. And so basically what I've done the first 5 years through the Peer-to-Peer Foundation is actually an attempt to tell a story. You know, my theorizing, if you like, is just an attempt to give kind of a grand narrative. I know that's not popular nowadays, but I actually do try to create a grand narrative based on all the concepts that I see emerging in peer-to-peer movements and kind of, you know, give a new coherence to it, to create a collective language and discourse that we can use in building our communities. But I think the next step in the next 5 years, at least for my community, will be, can we find ways to make ourselves sustainable and create solidarity mechanisms? Because that's missing, you know. If you're really in trouble today, very often your network cannot help you. There's no money there, you know. They can help you maybe find a job, but, you know, it's a really problem. We still need a nation state and a market in order to survive, and that weakens our connection, our network connections.
I want to thank the 4 panelists for fantastic presentations. Let's give them a hand. And thank you all for coming.